Welcome to W Report. This is an analytical transformation of an interview. Brian, Russia just launched its largest drone strike on Ukraine. Over 800 drones and missiles across the front. Trump now says he's disappointed in Moscow and backs new sanctions. NATO media frames this as proof that Russia doesn't want peace. Is that the reality, or just another political narrative?
Well, again, it's very important for people to understand what exactly this conflict is in the first place. The Trump administration itself has admitted and has blamed the previous Biden administration for starting the war, and they've characterized it as a U.S. proxy war against Russia. So it really is not up to Russia to end a war that is being waged against them by the United States, according to the Trump administration itself. It is up to the Trump administration to look at how this proxy war began, how it is being fought, and what measures need to be taken to stop it. For example, there is a U.S. military command in Germany right now overseeing the entire conflict in Ukraine. They are at the very top of the chain of command of Ukraine's armed forces, not Ukrainian generals, American generals. If President Trump put an end to that, brought these generals back home, or put them in charge of something that actually had to do with American national security, the war would end. It would end very quickly. Another factor fueling this war is the United States and its directive to the Europeans to continue funding and arming and training the Ukrainians. And again, as the Western media itself has admitted, the United States Central Intelligence Agency is running Ukraine's intelligence networks inside Ukraine right now. That is another aspect of this war that if President Trump decided, he could end overnight and the conflict would end. So he's not serious about ending this conflict. And if people look back at his rhetoric, even before the elections, he was more or less telling people that he had no intention of ending it. He told people what they wanted to hear. But if you looked at the so-called peace plans that were being proposed, he was talking about freezing the conflict, which is the overarching agenda of the United States, if you want to call it a deep state. This is what was already underway during the Biden administration. They were losing the proxy war. The prospect of Ukrainian lines collapsing were increasing. And so they wanted to freeze it. They do not want to end it. This is about pulling Russia in, tying them down, while the United States pivots to China, Iran, and elsewhere, and then circle back around to Russia later. This is referred to as strategic sequencing, and this is what policymakers involved in the current Trump administration have laid out extensively in policy papers spanning many years. The U.S. establishment, whether it's headed nominally by Democrats or Republicans, seeks primacy over the entire globe. All of these policy papers connected to either administration, all they talk about is maintaining America's dominance over the entire planet. It is to remain the largest sole superpower of the globe. And in order to do this, the United States needs to prevent all peer and near peer competitors from rising up and challenging its position globally. This is not about American national security. This is about America being able to do as it pleases worldwide, as it has for nearly a century now. And so strategic sequencing is a realization that the United States is incapable, does not have the resources to fight nations like Russia, China, Iran, and all of their allies around the globe all at the same time. They need to tie one down and then focus its resources on another. There's also this concept of division of labor, which was publicly stated by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth back in February. The need for nations, the U.S. essentially influences and for all intents and purposes controls, have them direct public resources to American foreign policy objectives. For Europe, for example, that would be taking public resources and channeling it into this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. For Japan or South Korea or now the Philippines, completely politically captured by the U.S., that is directing public resources that would be used for the people in these countries to building up their military and encroaching upon and encircling and containing China in the Asia-Pacific region. And so strategic sequencing, right now, as it stands, the U.S. is prioritizing China as the greatest threat to its hegemony, not to America where it exists on a map, but to its hegemony over the planet. And so they need to pause the conflict in Ukraine against Russia and pivot towards China. So this is strategic sequencing. Deal with China first and then circle back around to Russia later. But they cannot allow Russia the freedom to rebuild its military, to redirect its resources in support of its allies, which includes China. That's why they need to freeze the conflict in Ukraine, not end it.
Baltic lays it bare. The U.S. doesn't want to end the war. It wants to freeze it. And Trump, for all his talk, follows the same playbook. The key word is strategic sequencing. Russia is not the end game. It's Act 1. As Europe foots the bill for the proxy war, Washington shifts focus to China, planning to circle back later. In this geopolitical chess match, where some nations fight and others pull the strings, the question, who wants peace, becomes meaningless. The U.S. has invested heavily in Ukraine since 2014, rebuilding its intelligence, influencing media, military, and civil society through NGOs. Freezing the conflict now seems like a way to retain control while shifting focus elsewhere. But how deeply is the U.S. still involved in the war, despite this so-called pause?
Tremendously, and at every single level. And what they're realizing is that as things are going right now, if this continues, eventually Ukraine's military is going to collapse. And so they're preparing for that. Ideally, they would like to freeze it, like they did when this all first began in 2014, and the Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 agreements. That was a means of saving the Ukrainian military, which was on the verge of collapsing then, freezing it, and then allowing the U.S. and its client states across Europe to rebuild, reorganize, rearm Ukraine's forces for the next round of violence. So they're just seeking to do this all over again. Freeze it before they collapse, begin rearming them. And this is what the U.S. has tasked Europe with doing, because the U.S. needs to save its own resources for focusing on China, Iran, and elsewhere, as part of this strategic sequencing. The division of labor to absolve the U.S. from primarily investing in Ukraine, free up resources for elsewhere. So that is exactly what they're doing. They have no intention at all whatsoever of making any sort of peace with Russia. And as you point out, this goes all the way back to the beginning of the 21st century, and obviously well before it. And this demonstrates continuity of agenda. It does not matter who Americans vote for, who is in the White House, who controls Congress. This is a singular agenda that continues no matter what. And despite the very vocal opposition President Trump during the campaign season had against all, the so-called deep state and the forever wars abroad, he has continued absolutely every single war that he inherited from the Biden administration, just as Biden did from the Trump administration and Trump did from the Obama administration. And he has started new wars against Yemen and Iran. He is building up for war against Venezuela very openly and obviously. And they are still planning to pivot toward Asia. And so this all continues uninterrupted, and it will continue. It will not be America that restrains itself. There is no prospect of change in America politically. The special interests driving this are unelected. They are monolithic. There really is no one else in the U.S. capable of challenging or displacing them. It will be up to the multipolar world to stop and then eventually reverse this.
On one hand, Trump isn't afraid to talk to enemies. He met with Kim Jong-un and now with Putin. But behind these talks, military actions still take place, like the covert ops in North Korea. Now, there's talk of a Zelensky-Putin meeting. But if neither side, including the U.S., is ready to make real concessions, what's the point? Is this a peace process or just political theater?
Well, first, addressing President Trump's willingness to speak with supposed American adversaries or declared American adversaries. We have to think back to the time when Then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton met with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and they reset U.S.-Russian relations. And this was following another U.S. proxy war against Russia, this time using Georgia as a battering ram in 2008 against Russian forces along their southern border in the Caucasus region, and that was a failure. And the U.S. hit a brick wall, and they needed to reset their relations. So someone like U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who we know isn't interested in diplomacy at all, met with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. What was the purpose of this? It was to draw in the Russians and trick them. And that is exactly why President Trump is now meeting with people. And as you point out, even as he was meeting with North Korea's leadership, he had people inside North Korea murdering North Koreans. And then as he was talking with the Iranians, all along preparing to strike at and kill Iranians and wage war against Iran. So there is no actual interest in diplomacy. It is all a trick. It is to draw in other nations. It is to make the United States look like it is the reasonable one, and it is these nations that are intent on continuing the war. And I have a funny feeling that that is why President Trump wants President Putin to meet with President Zelensky. And I forget who says it. I don't think that President Putin would have said something like this, because he's usually very polite no matter how upset he is. But someone somewhere said that this would be like a dog is barking at you, and you get on your knees, your hands on your knees, and you bark back at the dog instead of talking to the person holding the leash. This is the equivalent of the Russians meeting with Ukraine's leadership when they're not actually in charge of anything. The people holding the leash is the United States. This is a U.S. war fought against Russia through Ukraine. And no amount of talking to Ukraine is going to change that. This needs to be resolved with the United States. And what we have seen is, despite Russia coming to these meetings and going through the motions, it is determined to solve this conflict on the battlefield. And that is what we are watching right now. They are remaining open to diplomacy. They know it will go nowhere, and they will settle this on the battlefield. And I think that is ultimately where this conflict will be settled.
The U.S. still hasn't offered a clear vision of peace, only a hegemonic model where other nations' security concerns are sidelined. Rather than adjusting to multipolarity, the focus seems to be on restoring unipolar dominance. Now, the media push a new talking point, that Russia is stringing along Trump and buying time. Is this based on reality or just another narrative shift? Has Russia changed its position?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. If the U.S. was actually interested in peace, it would be pursuing entirely different policies, and it isn't. So it's obvious that they have no interest in peace at all. And yes, Secretary of State Marco Rubio acknowledged the existence of the multipolar world, but only as an obstacle to climb over to reestablish American dominance over the planet. And they are obviously openly pursuing that across the four corners of the globe. Now, as far as Russia stringing the Americans along, as you said, Russia has been consistent all along. They have never changed their original demands. Everything that they had said in the very beginning remains in place, unchanged. And all they want is this proxy war being waged against them by the United States to end, and the very source driving this proxy war to be ended. And that is America's insistence on dominating the planet, dominating Europe, pushing its influence up to and all along Russia's borders, and even inside Russian borders. They demand that this stops. This is existential for them. This is not something that they're imagining. As we watch Syria disappear off the map, Libya already gone, U.S. forces still in Iraq, Iran being attacked out of the blue during negotiations. Russia isn't imagining this. And this is what they have demanded from day one. And the Americans refuse to acknowledge or accept this, and they will continue pushing. So they want the illusion of peace with Russia so they can freeze the conflict, so they can circle back around and finish it later. This is their intent. And at this point, it should be obvious to everybody, because like you said, if they were actually interested in working together with the rest of the world rather than imposing itself upon it, there would be definite policies at least being talked about. They're not even talking about policies like this. They're openly pursuing policies that feed into continued American primacy. Absolutely everything that they're doing, they're rebuilding their whole military to wage large-scale war against peer adversaries like Russia and China. Uh, the ERAM missile that they're talking about sending to Ukraine, so somewhere around 3,000 of them eventually, obviously not in the beginning. This is a munition that has been developed specifically for the type of warfare the U.S. envisions it itself will be fighting against nations like Russia and China in the near future. So they are fully preparing to continue this, continuing it more forcefully if necessary. And if they can buy time and perform strategic sequencing, that would be ideal. And that is where we are right now.
The U.S. claims to be a mediator, yet makes no concessions, despite admitting this is a proxy war. Why is Ukraine expected to renounce NATO membership while it's NATO and the U.S. pushing expansion? If Washington truly wanted peace, shouldn't it be the one to offer real steps instead of missiles and pressure?
Well, I mean, that's it exactly, isn't it? The U.S. is pursuing this war against Russia while also posing as mediator. That right there is a fundamental obstacle to achieving anything, because if you're not even being honest about what the conflict is, you're admitting that it's a proxy war, that it's your proxy war against Russia. You're blaming the Biden administration for starting it, which gives you an easy exit out of it. You could just say this was Biden's policy and we reject it. It was terrible. Look at what it has caused, and we are exiting from it. But the reality is, the same special interests that compelled the Biden administration to launch this proxy war, compelling the Trump administration to continue it. And again, just as we've already seen in this specific conflict, not even talking about elsewhere, the U.S. has used this cycle of propaganda, feigned desire for peace, and then continued war. They've already done this in regards to Ukraine, the Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 agreements. They're recreating this. And just because Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth back in February said this must not be Minsk 3.0 doesn't mean that it isn't exactly Minsk 3.0, because then he explains what it is. It is freezing the conflict along the line of contact. It is moving European troops into Ukraine to basically create a bluff against Russia. If you try to restart this, you're going to have to fight through European, essentially NATO troops. And Europe is going to continue arming and backing the Ukrainians, and they're going to rebuild and reorganize their military during this pause. So all that is Minsk 3.0. And so what the Trump administration is doing is trying to have it both ways, trying to absolve itself from responsibility for causing this or continuing this conflict, blame it on Russia for this conflict continuing, posing as some sort of mediator that is, we're just so frustrated that the Europeans and Ukrainians, who we completely control, won't make peace with Russia because we told them not to. I mean, this is exactly what's playing out. And the short and simplest answer is the U.S., this current administration and all administrations before it, they're just simply lying. They're lying about their intentions. And through their actions, we can see what their true intentions actually are. And that is to freeze this war, to wage much more dangerous wars elsewhere, and then circle back around to Ukraine and Russia again, because they've already done this cycle once already with the Minsk agreements.
Trump wants it both ways, claiming the war wouldn't have happened under him while also taking credit for arming Ukraine first. Obama, by contrast, warned against escalation, knowing Russia had the logistical edge and viewed this as existential. With diplomacy stalled, are we now heading toward a battlefield resolution? How close is that, and what's the current situation on the front lines?
Well, as you noted earlier, Russia carried out one of, or if not the largest drone and missile strike so far. But isn't that something we find ourselves saying almost every single month now? And this is because of Russia's military industrial capacity. It is not just enormous, but it continues to expand. And this is what myself and others, yourself, Alex and Alexander of the Duran, they have been following this for 3+ years now. Alexander McCure has called it aggressive attrition. That is exactly what the Russians are doing. And I still see Western analysts claiming, well, Russia is failing because they cannot break through. They're not breaking through here. Look at how little territory they've taken this month. It isn't about territory. It isn't about breaking through. It is about grinding Ukraine's fighting capacity down to where it eventually collapsed. This is what we actually saw in Syria. And in this case, it worked in favor of U.S. foreign policy objectives. That conflict was frozen for years. The front line didn't move anywhere. And then suddenly, because the Syrian Arab army was hollowed out over years and years, and because Russia and Iran were distracted elsewhere, eventually a hard push came and everything just collapsed. And that is possible in Ukraine. That is possible. And that is why the United States is telling Europe, you need to create a coalition of the willing. A lot of people imagine that Europe came up with this on their own. This was in the public directive Secretary Hegseth gave in February. He told the Europeans, you're going to send troops into Ukraine. And the reason they're sending troops into Ukraine is because they know that eventually Ukrainian lines are going to collapse. The military will collapse. We're already hearing admissions from Ukraine itself. They have so little manpower along the line of contact. There are entire sections of the front that just aren't even manned. There are defenses in place, but there are no people in those defenses. And that's why when you look at the map, you will see Russia break through, and then it'll start to expand. And then the Ukrainians, like a fire brigade, they have to send their reserves to that area, and then Russia will withdraw. They're not trying to break through and take that territory. They're trying to overstretch Ukrainian lines, and it's working. And we can see demonstratably so that the metrics of Ukraine's military power waning day by day. And there's nothing that the West can do about it except intervene directly and hope that the Russians pause for thought and stop instead of fighting through European troops at that point. That's where it is right now.
The picture is clear. The U.S. isn't seeking peace, it's seeking a pause. Whether it's Trump, Biden, or anyone else, the goal is not to end the proxy war, but to freeze it and return later. It's Minsk 3.0 rebranded, halt the front, rearm Ukraine, then pivot to the next target, like China. Trump plays both sides. I want peace, but I sent the first javelins. Meanwhile, every diplomatic move is just another setup. Talks as a trap. Ukraine isn't calling the shots. It's on a leash. And while the media blames Russia for buying time, it's Washington that's executing long-term strategic sequencing. Diplomacy is dead. Ukraine's military is depleted. And the real decisions aren't made in Kiev or Brussels, but in Washington. Everything else is just theater. Thanks for watching. Support the channel if you find this format valuable. More deep dives are coming soon. Until then, think for yourself and draw your own conclusions.